Swati Gupta, who's a faculty member at Georgia Tech. She will tell us about individual fairness in hindsight.
Thank you. Super excited to be here and to be a part of this wonderful workshop and the fairness cluster in the summer. This is joint work with a wonderful collaborator, Vijay Kamble, who's a faculty at UIC at the School of Business. And so after Aaron's talk, I think it sets the stage perfectly for individual fairness and extensions to other cases. And in this case specifically, we'll talk about extensions to time. And so I don't really need to go over this, but this was a really nice quote from Yeling Chen and Li Hu's paper, which I like. Nearly all theories of fairness are founded on an equality of some sort. The heart of the issue rests on clarifying the equality of what. And a large amount of work by amazing people in the audience, and in particular, we'll focus on equality of treatment. And so we are also thinking about individual fairness and individual fairness, and the concept that similar people should be treated similarly. And okay, so in classification setting, I think this is a pretty standard example where you could have people who are very similar in the context, but classification could take very different decisions for them. And that might be construed as unfair. And so people have sort of motivated the theory of random stochastic classifiers so that the decisions are probabilistic, and maybe that in the probabilities, at least we can say they're fair. But again, there's a question of, what does randomness mean, and does that actually, what do the probabilities actually qualify as? What does it mean to have a probability of a decision for a particular individual? And I'm not going to get into that debate here. So I'm going to view individual similarity as individual fairness as a Lipschitz constraint. So if I have two decisions, and my background is optimization, so I always think about polytopes and utilities that I want to maximize over the polytopes. So if I took, I had a cost vector and that gave me that vertex, then if I perturbed a cost vector, it could give me another vertex, which would be very different from each other, even though the costs were only perturbed slightly. And the individual fairness would say that, maybe you should take decisions which are closer to each other, and so it would enforce a Lipschitz constraint on the set of decisions that we have. And every context decision restricts the decision for some similar contexts, and the question that we want to answer is, or ask, is what about time? So imagine now decisions that are taken over a period of time. For instance, people going to banks, and there were some very nice talks about loans, but in this talk, I'm going to treat loan as a toy example. So please don't ding me about loans, but of course, happy to discuss and take questions. So suppose there's a bank that wants to give loans to individuals, and these individuals come over time, then is it fair to be constrained to taking similar loan decisions for those individuals over time? Or can the individuals, could the loans change over time dependent on what the bank maybe learns about those individuals' default rates, right? And so let's think about certain very natural temporal extensions, which is first fairness across time. And fairness across time is basically the simplest extension that one could think about is as contexts. So imagine people are contexts and they're coming over time. And as they come over time, maybe the decisions that we take for them are bounded by some Lipschitz constraint over the distance between the contexts. And this Lipschitz constraint could maybe get relaxed over time. Maybe you get a weaker constraint with respect to decisions that happened way in the past. So what does it look like? Let's say I want to take a decision between 0 and 1, and a context C1 arrives, and I decide to take a decision of 0.5. Then when the next context arrives in some space, then maybe the decision at C1, it constrains the decision for C2, and now I can take maybe slightly more of a decision, but that's constrained by the decision of C1. And Lipschitzness may be relaxed over time as time passes. So when C3 arrives, maybe blue has a weaker constraint, a larger ball, and the red dot enforces a smaller ball. And so the decision was taken to be at the intersection of those two. But note that as similar contexts arrive over time, if the same context arrives again, then it is constrained to get the same decision. So you cannot take a different decision even because the distance between those two contexts would be the same, or would be 0. Right. So fairness, this naive extension of fairness across time enforces the constraint that for the same individual, you must take the same decision irrespective of when they arrive in time. And that is a little bit problematic when we think about learning. So for instance, if a bank enters a new market, doesn't know if age is positively or negatively correlated with default rates, then if a wrong individual was given a loan, then that mistake must be repeated forever. Or a more broader societal example, if similar issues map to similar decisions, how do we reach laws and policies that get better over time? So for instance, if we had very constrained laws, maybe about human cloning, genetic editing, marijuana laws, then how do we sort of, as we get more information about a particular technology, how can we change laws over time? And so we want some sort of flexibility with fairness and flexibility in the decisions. And this, I want to highlight a quote by John Kleinberg in one of the talks he gave recently about safety and liveness of a system. So it would be very fair if the system kept making the same decisions for similar people over time, but then it would sort of not be a live system, it would not be able to operate. So we want to basically strike a balance between learnability and being able to operate in the online learning setting and enforce some sort of a fairness. And our proposal in that respect is individual fairness and hindsight. So equitable treatment relative to the past, but not necessarily with respect to the future, right? So if you look at the Lipschitz constraint that we had in the previous slide, then we can break it down into two constraints. One that says that you have a lower bound dependent on decisions that you've taken on the past, and those decisions produce a lower bound on the decisions that you're taking now, and an upper bound on the decisions relative to the decisions taken in the past, right? And we call the first notion as individual fairness and hindsight. And you'll see a lot of connections to many systems in the society and why this notion, this relaxation makes sense for a learning setting. Okay, so in the context of the loan example, for instance, what this constraint is saying is that, let's say at T1, somebody gets a $50,000 loan. Then at the next time period, if a similar individual arrives and they get more loan than what they initially had, a more conducive decision, right, then this is considered fair under our definition of individual fairness and hindsight. So the point is that this person will look at decisions taken in the past before them and then complain about the decision that was taken for them or feel that they were treated fairly. So as long as decisions become more conducive over time, it's great. People in the past will less frequently complain about the decisions that have been taken in the future. So we allow the relaxation that people in the past will not raise complaints. Again, at T3, somebody gets $80,000. That's great because it's more conducive than the decisions that similar people got in the past. But somebody getting $75,000 after that, that's unfair because they'll be like, oh, but somebody similar got a better treatment than me, and so why didn't I get that?
I don't normally sympathize with banks, but I mean, it seems like there's a ratchet effect here, and if the economy has a downturn or something and I simply have less resources, or I'm thinking about social services,
right,
I may need to pull back from this, right?
Right, and you would have a solid basis for pulling back. But think about scenarios where people were given varying kinds of prices. Let's say Uber rides used to be very minimally priced. They would be priced cheaper than public transport, but now they've increased the prices, and there is this growing sense of being treated unfairly by Uber. Right? Like even though they were burning through their funding initially, right? But had they done the opposite, had they started with something which was less conducive and moved towards a more conducive decision, people would have been great. Like, this is great. Uber is doing well as a company, and so we're getting back the money, and now maybe, we are being treated more fairly. Yes.
I guess, wouldn't you be concerned about adverse consequences if you had, say, historical prejudices such that at this bank, like historically, they gave a lot of loans to white individuals, but not to minority individuals. So conditional on the bank not necessarily having more money over time, they have to maintain the same level of lending towards white individuals, but now.
Right. So the point there would be that the distance that we would think between people who have between white and non-white individuals, the distance is so small that maybe the bank should not have differentiated. And an individually fair in hindsight policy would be to actually give them very similar loans. And you'll see an example of this. I can come back to this question in a few slides. Okay. So again, diagrammatically, the contexts that have arrived in the past will pose lower bounds on contexts that arrive in the future. And so if it's a similar context, then it will just give you a lower bound now, and it will not give you the ball constraint. But it's not an upper and a lower bound, it's just a lower bound. Right? So you have the option in this setup to improve decisions over time and make different decisions for the same context as it comes over time. Okay. So let's think about the prevalence in society of these concepts and a lot of inspiration that we drew from many existing systems. For instance, one major motivation came from directionality in law. So in law, there is a notion of stare decisis where you stand by things decided. So it's very seldom, it happens, but it's very seldom that people will complain about something that is done in the future and try to reevaluate a case that was decided in the past. But it's more often the case that cases in the past decide the treatment that cases in the present will get. Right? So to stand by things decided, decriminalization laws are often constrained as being fair when something was recognized as an illegal activity and now it's been decriminalized, then they're often construed as fair by society. Markdown promotions. So markdown promotions is a standard practice in a lot of revenue management firms and studies where consumers view perceptions of having promotions that go deeper with time. So promotions where you have subsequent discounts, they're considered fair. In fact, price exploration of items in the beginning is considered largely unfair, and that's what one of these papers talks about by Lisa Bolton et al. Rent control and stabilization. Again, it's an approximate situation. It's not exactly individual fairness in hindsight, but the fact that the rents have a controlled increase or a controlled decrease, and if the rents are decreased, then tenants don't complain, and if the rents are increased, they can only increase by a particular margin. You cannot have a high amount of non-conduciveness in the decisions. Whataboutisms. So there's a growing culture of whataboutisms where people complain that, oh, you're talking about a politician from my party, but what about the politician from your party who got a more conducive decision beforehand? And somehow that sets the trend that society should be probably more conducive, more accepting to conducive treatment. So with all of these examples, let's now think about some math and go into learnability and utility maximization under individual fairness in hindsight. And first, I want to consider a very simple scenario where there's a bank and there are two types of contexts, let's say blue and green people, and they are drawn stochastically from a distribution. And we want to maximize the utility from the decisions where some amount of loan is given to these people, and they either have a tendency to default or a tendency to not default, which is captured by that function f. So let's say there's 1/4 fraction of the population is blue, 3/4 of the population is green, and the context is modeled as -1 and +1. The Lipschitz constant is 0.25, so we can only differ in the decisions for these two contexts by 0.5. So right, and C1 defaults and C2 does not default, right? So if you so ideally you only want to give loans to this set of people, and that will be the red dot there at 1. But because your loans are constrained by individual similarity constraint, your loans for this group of people have to be at least 0.5. So that's what individual similarity gives us, that the loan has to be at least 0.5 because the difference between these two populations is small. Right? But since you want to maximize your utility, maybe you look at the maximum set of the population and you sort of cater your decisions towards that. Okay, so now let's look at individual fairness over time. and fairness across time, where we're trying to maximize the utility of these policies as more contexts come in and try to find what's an individually fair rule. So there's no learning involved currently. It's just a utility maximization of policies. And what we realized was that for these two definitions, and if you look at very small time horizons, it is possible that you get different utilities. So the maximum utilities under individual fairness in hindsight can be more than the maximum utility that you get under individual fairness across time. And a simple example to show that is the following, where you have maybe only 3 contexts arriving, and you know they're going to arrive. And because you suspect, when you see the first context in the fairness across time policy, because you suspect that the next arrivals might be from the green population, you maybe assign them a loan of half and half in anticipation of this one. But in fairness across fairness in hindsight, even if you suspect that more of the greens will come because they're the majority in the population, you can assign them 0 and you can increase that to beyond 0.5 because that's a more conducive decision and that's allowed under individual fairness in hindsight. But interestingly, over time, as limit goes to infinity, the maximum utility you can get by any of these policies, where you have individual fairness or individual fairness across time or individual fairness in hindsight, the maximum utility that you can get from each of these constrained policies is the same. And that's an interesting, I thought, an interesting proposition. All right. So let's get to the setting of learnability of utility. So now we have a notion of fairness across time, and how does that impact learnability of utility in a learning setting? So let's say if the first context is given a loan of some amount in fairness across time, then over all time periods, it is constrained to get that same amount of loan, right? Because fairness across time, it does not allow you to take different decisions for different groups of people. Once you've resigned to a decision, you cannot change the decision over time. So moving away from that in fairness across hindsight, we propose a very simple algorithm that's quite intuitive. So what it does is, we call it CAFE. It's cautious fair exploration. So you start with very conservative decisions at the beginning, which are not conducive. So extremely conservative decisions at the beginning. And once you have enough evidence of how the world's operating, then you can sort of move monotonically to a conducive policy that's also individually fair. So the learning phase until sufficient evidence. So in the loan example, maybe explore with an epsilon amount of loan for all populations and gather enough evidence. So learn until you have sufficient evidence. And once you have that evidence, then you can monotonically increase the loan amounts for populations that did not defaulted. And you can increase this to a set of policies that enforce the individual fairness constraint without time. So let's see a simulation of this. So let's say, again, you have those 2 sets of population groups, 1/4 and 3/4 with the fraction of people. And as each of these come, you give the same amount of loan epsilon to all of these members. And once the exploration phase ends, and you realize that actually this is the group that defaults and this is the group that does not default, then you can monotonically increase your loan amount to 0.5. Here, the best individually fair rule is 0 and 0.5. Because remember, the Lipschitz constant allowed you to only deviate by 0.5. Right? So now, because the majority defaults and the minority does not default, so your best utility maximization rule is 0 and 0.5. And so you can monotonically increase, because even though you violate individual fairness here, you don't violate individual fairness in hindsight, because decisions have become better over time.
So I'm more used to think about contextual bandits, so which is kind of case here as well. So what's the set of policy I should be thinking about?
So so the contexts are sort of coming stochastically to you. And for each context, you do need to give a decision. For contextual bandits, I think you can allow yourself to not make a decision and not pull an arm.
Right, so I'm thinking about the arm is really a continuum between 0 and 1. You can
Yes.
decide certain certain amount to give each individual. So I guess just a continuum arm instead.
Right. So continuum of arms, but here really in the initial phase. So whenever you increase your decisions for a particular arm, individual fairness and hindsight will basically say that you cannot decrease the decision back. So your increase has to be, it's not reversible. It has to be very thought of. Like when you have enough confidence, and maybe you can increase that.
I see. So I guess I have really two small questions about the model.
Yeah.
One is like, are you restricting yourself to consider a subset of mapping from context to some real value between 0 and 1, or just arbitrary mapping? And then second is, what is the reward relationship between say 0.5 and 0.7? Like, I guess there's some monotone structure you're learning because, like, giving a small.
So individual fairness and hindsight imposes a monotonic structure in the direction of conduciveness, right? And maybe you say that getting lower amount of loans is more conducive because then people are not indebted, and maybe right, like it's better for their mental health or something, and that's fine. Like so, it depends on the notion of conduciveness, is the monotonicity. The arms are contexts are stochastically drawn here, so they're not coming in adversarially.
Sure.
The decisions are the decisions have to be Lipschitz with respect to the distance in the constraint in the contexts, and we allow for any map between the contexts and decisions.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as it's Lipschitz with respect to the similarity metric.
Okay.
I'm confused why this wouldn't, like, in the learning phase, let's say it learns that the black minority in the population default more, and it's ignoring all the systemic reasons why that may be happening, all the historical systemic reasons, but then it learns like, oh, okay, I'm justified now, and if the distance metric recreates races, or it doesn't very much imagine doing that in many cases.
Right. So we did think a little bit about what if your confidence about the world changes, or what if something systemic about the world changes. And one interesting sort of idea that's again seen in the law is that maybe the law is operated in a certain way, and then there was an increasing confidence that the society is no longer what you thought it was. And maybe those laws made sense like 50 years back or 100 years back, but they don't now. And then legally there's a case of first impression that happens. And after that, you sort of set a new precedent that's followed, right? So that's a great question. And maybe some extensions where you pay a high cost, and then you're able to change your direction. You sort of break away, like a high cost, which is maybe the cost of fighting the case or something, and then you're able to break away from that precedent. So maybe a switching setting where you want to satisfy individual fairness and hindsight, but maybe there are certain breakpoints you're allowed, like K switches or K changes, where you can break the constraints to sort of incorporate new evidence that you've gotten. But yeah, very open. Like I think this is like just sort of a start, like a very recent work.
Yes. I mean, kind of along these lines, you could even call that a different context once you account for sort of like laws changing or like, societal shifts. And then even like the same person who has the same attributes who arrives later.
Right, maybe you observe some new attributes to them, or maybe your metric changed over time, and maybe you realize that people who were considered similar should not be. Maybe the race example that we saw, where African Americans have more biodiversity than cross racial groups, right? So all open questions. All right, so that's how CAFE explores and then exploits. And one of the questions that one could also ask at this point is how conservative do you need to be in your decisions, right? So you might be too conservative and not gain any evidence from the world, right? So I might give 0 loans to people, or I might give $5, and everybody sort of does not default on that, and they give everybody gives $5 back. So if my epsilon or my most conservative decision is too conservative that I do not get sufficient evidence to make decisions in the future, for instance, maybe all research stopped because the laws were too strict for that, and there was no exploration. There was no information that you could get from those small decisions. Then the question is, how conservative do we need to be? And the problem is that with fairness and hindsight, aggressive exploration in the beginning will enforce the constraint that you have to adhere to that increased amount of loan or that increased amount of conduciveness in the decisions. And it's an important trade-off where how small can you get while gathering sufficient evidence to enforce regret, formally speaking, to get low regret, formally speaking, and and you sort of resign yourself to those large epsilons if you commit to them initially. And so we formalize that in by understanding the KL divergence between populations. So if your KL divergence might go to 0 as your loan goes to 0, so you cannot distinguish between those two populations at all. But as if the rate is nice enough, then you can get order log t regret. If the rate is really small, then we get some worst regret bounds, and we also give matching instances to talk about order optimality of these bounds. And another so that's sort of the main theoretical theorem that we have. And with this, I wanted to also mention GDPR, where data subjects have access rights and where they can question the algorithm about, why was this decision taken for me? And we thought that CAFE was an interesting example where it gives me a sequence of lower bounds from previous decisions. And a decision maker could just say that, because I had to take these decisions for these previous contexts that are right, this is why I had to make this decision for you. And this aspect of trying to explain online learning algorithms, I thought is also interesting and an open area to explore. That how can you sort of quantify that? Now I have enough evidence to treat you in a particular way and tell those and make that transparent to people. So with that, I finished 15 minutes early, but I think that's okay because we're all eager to go to lunch, and happy to take any questions.
Maybe just a comment. So I guess the way you framed this, including like the title, Hindsight, you're focusing on an arrow in time.
Yes.
But it seems to me that equally important is a sense of arrow of progress or generosity or whatever. So it's one thing to say that giving you more loans that's nice for you, and of course I agree that letting people marry each other is a step upward in human freedom. But of course, people disagree about these things, and especially in public policy, if I replace income taxes with carbon taxes or vice versa, is this a move upward or downward? And so if I let you do this, if I impose a bound in one direction, is this a ceiling or a floor? And so I don't know. That's I'm a little confused about that.
So the way I process it sometimes is that our notion of conduciveness just changes over time, as maybe the directive from media changes, or maybe the way our policies change, or maybe the way our education system changes, right? Like we change our notion of what's more conducive or what's a fairer goal to reach, and maybe that's okay.
Just as a comment too, because you specifically mentioned decriminalizing marijuana as like sort of an example of like progress moving forward. In cases like that, you also have issues of like amnesty for people like for contexts in the past that want to now like reevaluate, like which you can think of as the opposite of hindsight, where like an appeals process might be a past case looking forward. How do you reconcile that?
So those are less frequent than cases where a precedent is set and has to be met going forward.
So you see that as like an anomaly within this directional law.
Right.
I have one small question. So usually the better algorithm is the adaptive exploration in online learning.
Yes.
Have you thought about alternative formulation of this fairness across time constraint that may be amenable to this kind of adaptive exploration?
So the one of the ideas that we've been thinking about is switching.
What's that?
Is switching, like constant number, some degrees of freedom where you can switch, or some cost that you can bear while breaking this constraint and switching your direction. And but that would still constrain the number of non-monotonic decisions that you can make over time, right? So if you switch, then maybe you break the monotonicity, you come here, but you pay a cost for that.
So you have a budget of how many violations you might
Maybe
have.
a budget on how much violation you can have. But the fact that right now people sort of are non-monotonically changing decisions all over the place, I think that's something we want to avoid and enforce more structure on exploration.
Kevin?
Oh, that's like basically swap regret, right?
That's basically what?
Swap regret? Like, you would say be fair subject to swap regret. Or,
Maybe you should tell me more about it. Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't heard the term, but I've heard switching, but I've not
I
heard
think
swap regret.
I think that's
Okay.
swap regret, yeah.
All right, let's thank Aaron and Swati again.